what's interesting is the more they do dig up the ground in, the Middle East, in Israel and so on, the more they find that...
Is there any archaeological evidence that you could think of that proves an aspect of the biblical narrative to be true or confirms something regarding Jesus and the early church that comes to mind as like a hard piece of evidence?
Yeah, I mean, this is the fascinating thing about archaeology is you only have just a fragment of what was around in ancient times.
Sure.
Okay, and the things that tend to get left behind are the things that survive, like coins. Okay, statues, maybe. You don't like stuff that's written down on papyrus that quickly evaporates, buildings get demolished. It's actually surprising how little we can actually get up from the ground very often. And most of what you get simply is a reminder of the most significant figures of the time, the most powerful figures of the time. The Caesars, the emperors, they're the ones who had the statues and whose faces were on the coins and that kind of thing. So the fact we've almost got anything really that corroborates the biblical story is in itself a kind of a mini miracle, because Jesus was not a emperor or a Caesar or a kind of military commander. He was kind of this, in the eyes of the Roman Empire, this nobody from the back of nowhere. Okay, and yet we have, firstly, obviously, 4 Gospels, which have survived remarkably, and which and that's the first thing to say is just the Gospels themselves and the writings of the early church. They are such a good evidence of the historicity of this story, because we have more of them dating back earlier than almost any other kind of writings we have for other ancient figures. So that's really important to recognize. It's not just archaeology, it's kind of the written accounts. And that in itself is kind of a miracle, that we've just got such an abundance of evidence for the story of Jesus in the Gospels, in the early writings of Paul and elsewhere. But yeah, in terms of the actual archaeology, the stuff you can dig out of the ground, what's interesting is the more they do dig up the ground in, the Middle East, in Israel and so on, the more they find that things that they once thought sort of couldn't be corroborated or were maybe even made up in the Gospels or in the Bible, it turns out that there's something that makes sense of it. So I'm thinking of a lot of people have questioned whether the accounts of Jesus' birth are reliable, because there's accounts of him being born under a particular governor, and people look at this and say, oh, they must have got this wrong because it's the wrong time. Well, it turns out they now discover that there is actually a kind of headstone that it turns out has the same name of the governor. There's might have been 2 governors with the same name. You get all of that stuff happening all the time. Every time that there's a kind of, people make an assumption, I find, that, oh, the Bible got it wrong. You frequently find when you do uncover evidence, it turns out, they knew more than we know. It turns out there's something. So that kind of stuff is happening all the time. I mean, one great example of this that I talk about in my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, is the pool of Siloam. So this comes up in John chapter 9, and it's the story of Jesus healing a man. And it's at this pool, it takes place at this pool where people went to bathe in the waters because they thought it had these kind of healing properties and so on. And a lot of people just assumed this pool didn't exist. It was perhaps made up in the book of John, because no one could found it. There was no evidence that this place existed until just a few years ago, when they were kind of doing some excavations in Jerusalem, and suddenly they found this ancient pool, and they got it excavated, and they did an analysis, and they looked at some of the coins that were in the plaster, and these were coins that dated to just before and just after the time when Jesus would have been alive and in his ministry. So it dates to the exact time when Jesus was doing his ministry. It makes perfect sense of the story. It's suddenly the pool of Siloam exists, and suddenly the skeptics who said, "Oh, this was just fabricated, this was just a theological invention." Hey, it turns out there's a pool of Siloam. So these kinds of things happen surprisingly, and it's not that therefore tells you this story definitely happened, but it corroborates the story, and that's the point. And we're never going to kind of, in a sense, have the kind of archaeological evidence that says Jesus definitely healed this person, this thing definitely happened. But what you have is every time we do uncover archaeology, it corroborates, it supports the general thesis. And that's true of even things like, a lot of people were skeptical of the idea that Jesus preached in the synagogue, for instance, in Nazareth. They said at the time, Nazareth didn't have a synagogue. This must have just been made up later by some writers. Hey, archaeological evidence turns up synagogue in Nazareth. So there's lots of things where skepticism often does get overturned increasingly by the best archaeology and that kind of thing. What you rarely find is archaeology contradicting the Bible, if you like. It always seems to go in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Yeah. I was in Israel at the end of 2022, and that was the most astonishing thing was how much they kept finding to even things like the city of David, where they were like, oh, we don't really know if David was a real guy from history. And then like, sure enough, right outside the Temple Mount, they find this elaborate city that they say is the city of David. We saw that same pool and walked to that location, which is relatively a modern excavation. So yeah, there's always stuff. So that to me is super interesting, is the archaeological evidence that seems to keep, to your point, proving and confirming aspects of the Bible.
And this is the big difference between something like Christianity and something like, say, Mormonism, which also has claims about history, but they can't provide any archaeological evidence of Jesus appearing to ancient tribes in South America, or any of the kind of stories that you find in the Book of Mormon. And that's the huge difference, is it's kind of a lot more obvious when someone is kind of inventing something from whole cloth than when someone is placing their story in a very obvious historical framework. And this is the beauty for me of the Christian story. It's not just a set of moral precepts and commands. It's not something that was just given to someone in a vision. You know, it's not like Mormonism kind of basically comes out of Joseph Smith saying he discovered these writings on some golden tablets and so on. That's a very personal, you know, that's only he can kind of corroborate that. Muhammad, you know, he wrote the Quran from supposedly visitations from an angel. Again, there's no way of you corroborating any of that, because that's just someone's private angelic visitation.
The argument to corroborate that is, well, look at how magnificent the writings are. I started a debate on, I think Trent Horn is debating someone that's a Mormon, and the opening line is like, there's no way that the literary evidence of how great the Book of Mormon is written, there's no way this could be written by a man with a third grade education. You know,
and
the problem
is that's a very subjective standard that you're applying to that. But the point is, unlike all those other religions and claims that are essentially based in personal experiences, Christianity is based on historical claims that were available to everyone at the time. Okay, if you wanted to show that these followers talking about a resurrected Messiah were false, you could have, if you had the body, you could have produced it. You know, there were lots of people around to contradict these historical claims that were being made by people. So it's the fact that Christianity is grounded in a time, place, specific arguments, specific claims about historical events, not some kind of vague spiritual, you know, I later discovered this in a revelation stuff. And that's what I love about Christianity. It's falsifiable in that sense. And that sounds like a bad thing, but actually an argument is only an argument if it's falsifiable. You could be wrong about it, okay? And because it's based in historical facts, you could be shown wrong. You know, if we dug up something that we could show was the body of Jesus, we'd all be wrong about Christianity, okay? But that's what I love about it. It is actually something where you say, something happened. Something really happened. People had access to this, could have been contradicted, but this movement flourished because actually it turned out stuff happened and people were reacting to it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Hey, thank you so much for checking out the video. Comment down below and let me know what you think. And be sure to check out this video that YouTube is recommending just for you. Let me know if they nailed it. All right? I'll see you over there. Peace.